You were the child of missionary parents born in Pakistan. Your family exposed you to different worldviews so that you could share your faith with others. And what were some of the worldviews that you were exposed to as a child? What were you experiencing in Pakistan?
Yeah, I was only in Pakistan until I was 1. So I don't remember Pakistan at all. We left during the Gulf War. My parents were there from 1989 to 1993. And then we left shortly after because of a number of things that took place. Chiefly, the Gulf War broke out, Pakistan sided with Saddam Hussein, and so it just wasn't a safe place to be. Mm-hmm. And then we were back for a year in the city of Toronto, which is where my dad's family is from, and then ended up going back to the missions field, where my parents worked in Amman, Jordan, for a number of years, in which my dad was the chaplain at the British Embassy in the city of Amman for a short period of time. And so, that certainly played into my interest later in life in the interacting with the worldview of Islam, in that I felt like there were certain ideas and presuppositions that I was exposed to, at least, in a minor way. And then, of course, like you mentioned, we had a Quran on the shelf at home. We had, some of those other worldview perspectives. And it wasn't necessarily that my parents were exposing them to me in that, we didn't sit down and read the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita or the Book of Mormon together. But it was always this passive understanding that these are here and they're not scary. And that if we believe that Christianity is the truth, the awareness of these is ultimately going to be able to stand up against the scrutiny of what is true with a capital T. And so maybe that was, subconscious in my mind, but it always kind of was there to the point when I was asking some of those questions about, I know what my parents raised me to believe, but do I believe it simply because they told me to? Which, by the way, isn't a bad reason. I want my kids to believe what I believe based on what I communicate to them. But also, some of that personal investigation, it was as simple as walking into the living room and pulling the Quran off the shelf and digging in and thinking, okay, let's try to at least understand this from the perspective of someone who would adhere to this faith, even if that wasn't necessarily where I was at that point.
It's incredible. I think a lot of people don't open the texts of other world religions because they're intimidated or nervous, and they think it will shake their faith. Or I just think that accessibility at a young age would shape who you are today in so many ways, because you engage so often with other worldviews from the perspective of what the Bible says and who Jesus said he was. Going back to some of those younger years, just before your 12th birthday, you had a very significant medical miracle. And I don't know if everyone tuning in right now knows about that. I think some people do. Would you share that story with us?
Yeah, so that was just before my 12th birthday. In January of that year, I was home from school because I was sick. I had the flu. And I'd gone down for a nap, and when I woke up, I couldn't feel my legs. And so I was eventually rushed from one hospital to another, and then shortly after that diagnosed with a neurological condition called acute transverse myelitis, which is initiated, which for me in particular was initiated by the flu that I had, my body's immune system reacting and attacking the nerve endings at the base of my spinal cord instead of attacking the flu. So it was a fluke condition, wasn't necessarily what your body's supposed to do in that situation, but severed the myelin sheath at the base of my spinal cord that disconnected the communication between my brain and my legs. And so the diagnosis was that I would most likely be a paraplegic for the rest of my life. And so there was, that reality for me. I turned 12 the next month. So it was literally just prior to that. And the short story that I often say is that 1 month exactly from the day I woke up on January 8th and couldn't feel my legs. On February 8th, I woke up, got up on a Saturday morning, walked over to my wheelchair and sat down. And that was it. And so it was as quickly as it happened, it went away. And the kind of shock about that situation was that what I was told was the severity of the condition was related to the speed in which the paralysis took place. And so because the paralysis was instant, the prognosis of recovery was quite long. They anticipated that it wasn't impossible for me to walk again, but it would be a long, years-long period of physiotherapy and trying to reconnect my body's, nerve reaction to remembering how to walk again. And so because it was gone as quickly as it started, that was the biggest shock medically in that regard. It wasn't necessarily that I had walked, because people do recover from transverse myelitis. It was the acuteness of the transverse myelitis that was really what ended up with the doctors using themselves a word like miracle.
So you heard them say that?
Yeah, the doctors used the word before, as far as I'm aware, anybody else did in terms of that.
Coming out of that, you went from, and I read a bit about this, so you suddenly had to change your bedroom, you had to go to the main floor of your house, you had to put wheelchair accessible areas into your house. Your whole world changed. You went from being a young person who had full physical ability to someone who was restricted to a wheelchair, and then out of that, again, physically able, all in 1 month. And do you think that had an impact on your adolescence, your young adult years, the shaping of your faith, the questions you might have for God? How do you think that impacted who you were becoming?
Yeah, I think it would be hard for it not to have affected me. Close to that time frame, I think it really hadn't materialized for me what had taken place. I think for a long time I was just in shock from initially being paralyzed, and then in shock that it was over, because of the kind of 180 shifts, what's it called when you get into a car accident? You get whiplash, whiplash that you encounter. But it did definitely play on how I viewed the world going forward, in that I understood that I felt like I'd been exposed to how easy it was to take advantage of something as simple as walking. Walking into a room, walking out of a room, getting up in the morning and be able to do just simple tasks. And in that sense, I committed early on, as an adolescent and a teenager, to being involved in athletics, because I felt a conviction towards, I should do something with this. But even, in those instances, you can turn those into idols, and that I felt that God had allowed me to experience this because I was going to be the next Eric Little. I was going to be the next Olympic athlete who was going to make a difference for God by showing that. And it very quickly became me-focused in that regard. And it's easy to see how we often take the spotlight off of something that God is legitimately doing. And like Calvin says, our hearts are factories of idols. We make it about us. So it impacted me very positively, I think, in terms of shaping, how do I think about these very simple things. But then also, I can likewise see, looking back in hindsight, I was still trying to make it about me in some ways. But as, an adolescent, as a young person, asking questions about, why did this happen to me? My family's a good family. My dad's a pastor, missionary family. They were doing all the quote-unquote right things. Why is it that God allowed this particular thing to transpire in my life? And that did shape some of the ways that I thought about the more complicated philosophical questions later on that maybe I found more concrete answers for in my teen years. But it also changed in that, that heart experience of medical professionals saying, you're not going to walk, they're walking, we don't have an explanation. This is something that there's not really kind of a fact sheet for, impacting me, to still having intellectual questions later on in life.
Asking that question, why me, it starts to tease at the question of why would a good God allow bad things to happen to people? And I think we're going to get into that in a bit, because we've got some questions from Millennials and from Gen Z directly for you, questions like that, that would connect to the apologetics calling you have today and what you're doing to serve God today. Let's talk a bit about your scholarship today. So you do have 2 degrees already. Now you're working on your PhD, and you're in your dissertation season. Mm-hmm. Okay, talk to us a bit about the ancient languages that you work with, as well as the manuscripts, and why that matters when it comes to the validity and the historicity of the Bible.
Yeah, so I got interested very early on in the written documentation of the Bible. So the Bible didn't fall out of the sky. It didn't come with a leather cover and, edging, gold edging on the pages. The Bible looks very different today than it has throughout the last 2,000 years plus, right? So digging into these questions of, 66 books written over 1,600 years on 3 different continents by close to 40 different authors in 3 different languages. How do we then look at the history of going from ancient papyrus to modern day print? That was something that I found very interesting early on, chief of which is because when I was involved in my first degree, in my undergrad at York University, and I was having evangelistic type, apologetic oriented conversations about the existence of God, the problem of evil, all of these things that are kind of stock apologetic questions. Stock for a good reason, they're the questions we all ask. A lot of my answers were based on the Bible and the Christian worldview, and people would point this out, that sounds great, Wes, but that's contingent on the Bible, and the Bible, well, you can't trust that for this reason and that reason. And so I thought, those are legitimate critiques at the base of it, in that I am staking a lot of this on this collection of ancient books. And if those are corrupted, if those are affected by history, or they're altered, or maybe I'm reading the wrong books, maybe I should be reading the Gospel of Thomas and not the Gospel of Matthew, then I wanted to get to the bottom of those questions. And so it was in search of those answers, in trying to figure out, is this legitimate? Is my foundation point for this person Jesus of Nazareth, where I find the primary sources in the Gospels, is that a good place to look? And so it was looking into that and finding, no, that is a good place to look. There is a lot of evidence. There's a history that goes back 2,000 years. We can have confidence that what we have now is what the original authors wrote, and that those are the books that should, in fact, be there. They're the ones that get us closest to, say, the time of Jesus for the Gospels and those biographical sources that we call Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And that led me eventually to the doctoral work that I'm doing right now, which is in early scribal culture. So I look at manuscripts, handwritten copies of the biblical documents, but also a few others. So I'm looking at some classical works of literature and some apocryphal texts. So documents like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter or Mary or Judas. Mm-hmm. Documents that were written in the decades and centuries after the ones of the biblical Gospels were written, but that also have kind of characteristics of the scribes and copyists who were producing these documents in this chunk of time of antiquity. And so I spend a lot of my time reading dead languages like Greek and Coptic. Okay. Greek being, what was the primary language in the ancient world at that time.
The Koine Greek.
Yeah. So Koine Greek, Common Greek, is what the New Testament is written in. Classical Greek is also, part of what I'm reading in terms of some of the other writings. Tacitus, Xenophon, Plutarch, they were writing in kind of a higher form of Greek. Okay. But then also looking at Coptic, which is a form of ancient Egyptian, but it's ancient Egyptian as it functioned in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries, where it had adopted the basics of the Greek alphabet with a few other letters in there. And that's what they were writing in Egypt, along with Greek, because Greek was just kind of everywhere saturated in that time period. And so we do have copies of Christian documents that are written in Coptic, along with other documents. The Gospel of Thomas in its final version is written in Coptic, not Greek. And so looking at these things and looking at, can we, by nature of the particular writing habits of the scribes and copyists who produced these, discern whether this was a document that was produced for a public liturgical setting, were they reading these out loud within a Christian community or a pagan community, or was this someone's, say, private copy of the Gospel of John? So can that actually be concluded from the maybe fragments of these texts that exist from the 2nd and 3rd centuries?
And through all this research, you've also done an amazing series with Apologetics Canada, Can I Trust the Bible? And you took viewers to Egypt. Mm-hmm. And I just, I want people to watch those those amazing pieces, and I want them to absorb what you're saying there. But for a fast moment here, if someone's watching and they say, why did you go to Egypt, and can I trust the Bible? Can I really trust what the Bible says? What would you say?
Yeah, well, the answer to the second question is yes, you can trust the Bible. The answer to the first question is people might be surprised that the majority of those manuscripts as handwritten copies that we have come from Egypt, and that largely has to do with the climate. So it was the availability of material. Papyrus, which was the plant, the reed that grew along the Nile River, didn't grow exclusively in Egypt, but grew primarily in Egypt. And so the means of production was happening in Egypt, so it was more available, and it was the optimal place to be produced. And because of the dry climate, the arid climate of particularly Upper Egypt, which is ironically lower down the Nile, it just kind of preserves everything in a time capsule. This is why we have so many mummies, right? They weren't burying more people than anybody else, but the climate lends itself to, when you stick it in the ground, when it's covered in the sand, it just stays. And so because of the nature of that, we have a lot more documentation that comes out of particular places in these cities along the Nile River than we do in somewhere like the Mediterranean, where it's a little bit more humid. And so, if we buried something out here, it's not gonna last, maybe it'll last a couple hundred years, but the paper is going to disintegrate, bugs are gonna eat it. The nature of what both took place within the means of production of written materials in Egypt, as well as the environment, lent itself to preserving. And so we went to Egypt to tell the narratives and stories about some of these earliest copies that we have that preserve for us the 27 documents that we call the New Testament. But also going somewhere like Nag Hammadi, where the Nag Hammadi Library was discovered in 1948, which included some of these other books, the Gospel of Philip, the Secret Gospel of James, the Gospel of Thomas, and talking through, okay, well, why wasn't that included? What are the reasons that we have to have confidence that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the Gospels that should be the first three, and not Peter and Philip and Thomas? Should those actually be in our Bible? And the answer is no, and we take the viewer on the journey of answering and giving the evidence for why that's the case.
Well, and that's my burning question right now as you're talking, right? And I think, why were certain books of the Bible chosen and not the others? And when you talk about Apocrypha, these are books that are not included in the Bible, but they might be historical documents and reflecting parts of Jesus' life, the way they're written. And I guess we've got to tune in to Can I Trust the Bible? I like that cliffhanger. Is there one manuscript, ancient manuscript, that you've held that has completely impacted you, changed your heart, your faith? And how old was it, and which one was it?
I don't think there's one that's necessarily kind of affected me strongly. Every time I get the opportunity to be able to hold in my hand or view something that goes, say, back to the 2nd or 3rd century, what it does for me is it encapsulates the fact that I can, to some degree, standing in front of, say, a 2nd century fragment of the Gospel of John, which I've done, what I feel in that moment is, who was the person 2,000 years ago, almost 2,000 years, who was likewise standing in front of this piece of written material and putting the ink on the page. It's this kind of looking down the timeline of history and including myself in it to some degree, within the family tree of, there's no way to know whether the scribe was a Christian or not, but even hypothetically just kind of putting the idea in that maybe this was a late 2nd century Christian, and it would have been very costly for them to inscribe, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, onto a piece of material in a time frame when they could have been in a region that was illegal to do so. And so being in the family tree of historical Christianity and finding myself on a branch almost 2,000 years later, tying myself tangibly to that point in time, to that person, I think does something to the nature of the faith that I believe, in that I'm not an island. I'm part of a broader story that God has invited me into and invited so many other people, going back to, calling the patriarchs, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God is a personal God and invites us all into that narrative and story. So it's this unique perspective of looking at an artifact and the artifact tying my own personal faith journey into.
Have you held any manuscripts that are, whether it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, any pieces of those manuscripts written by somebody who directly witnessed the life of Christ, that you're like, this is John. John wrote this. I'm holding it.
No, and the fact is we don't have any documents, written kind of artifacts of papyrus or parchment that would go back that early. The earliest documents that we have of the Bible go back to the 2nd century. But I think what we can say about that is that what we're dealing with, though it be a copy, is a copy that reflects what the original was written about. And this is also testified to by some of the early Christian writers who themselves were disciples of the disciples. So you have this category of people who we call the apostolic fathers, and they're called that particularly because they had a direct tie to Peter, to John, to Paul, and can comment on something like, we know who Mark is. He's the traveling companion of Peter. He wrote down that which Peter told him. We have these kind of testimonies. And so if we're going to call it like the dating of how we know that those documents are 1st century, coming in the eyewitness period, it's less to do with the tangible manuscript evidence that we have in saying, this was written by John, because I'm not even sure how you would identify that, even if we did find a 1st century manuscript.
I think it's my wishful thinking.
Yeah. And I think, in a modern sense, we have the capability to tie things back to, but that's true for everything from the ancient world. We have no document that we can call the original autograph of, whether that's Caesar or whether that's Marcus Aurelius, Plutarch, Xenophon, Tacitus, any of these ancient writers. We're all dealing with copies of copies of copies. And that doesn't dilute our ability to know that that is what the original authors wrote, but it's this fascinating network of the fact that the early Christians were very tenacious to get the gospel message out. And so the fact that we find copies in Egypt, but then also later on in places like Britain and across Asia and all over Europe and North Africa, is a testament to the Christians were very eager to get the message of who Jesus was. And that meant that it was spread very far and very fast, very early on, which precluded any one person or group of people controlling the text at any one point in time. So though we don't have a copy that we can say, actually this is Matthew's copy and he wrote this with his own hand, the fact that we have copies of Matthew that are so widely spread throughout the ancient world, and we can compare them, and even if differences pop up in Asia, we know that those differences are geographically located because we don't find them in Europe or in North Africa. And so if someone wanted to, in a kind of Da Vinci Code-esque way, write in a particular doctrine to the Bible, they would have had to have the means of control to find all the copies in all the other places all across the ancient world and alter them. And that would have been just impossible because there are copies buried in the sands of Egypt. They would have had no idea.
And that's interesting because these stories line up amongst all these copies, these oral traditions that are passed on, then written down. The stories about Jesus line up. So you're right. In fact, the more copies there are, the more evidence there is that the stories about him are true and valid. I love how you've unpacked so much and how you work so hard to get to the bottom of things. And I've got a really special question for you, which is on a lot of our hearts. We know that a lot of millennials, and you would fall in that category, have deconstructed their faith. And it's almost left them with no faith. It's like, what do I believe? I can't believe in anything. And it's actually a very painful place for them to be in. They're really, struggling. So any of those who had followed Jesus, maybe they've walked away. But many are also coming back to their faith, and I feel like part of it is the research that people like you are doing, giving them different answers than maybe what their parents are giving them. What do you think's happening with millennials today who've deconstructed their faith but are coming back to faith?
Yeah, I think we're in a unique point in time where people are open to certain things, and maybe they're in some regards disenfranchised with a superficial religiosity that they may have experienced. If they did grow up in the church, say, in my instance, in the early 2000s, there was a lot of just kind of superficiality, seeker sensitivity that I think had the right motivation, but the wrong method by which to go about that. In that they genuinely saw that they wanted to get people through the doors of the church, which is a good goal to have. But in doing so, what they were trying to win them with is what they won them to. And so because it was very superficial, it was very kind of on the surface, it didn't have any substantial depth. When the winds and the rains of trial and suffering, hurt, did eventually come, there was no root system to be able to ground them. You talked about, that having that foundation before. When my parents lived in Ontario, we moved our family across to British Columbia for a couple of years. And when we did move, my dad, my grandfather, and I drove our van and a U-Haul trailer across the country. And I remember very vividly in Saskatchewan driving across like the very flat fields, right, watching a dog run away for a week. And seeing this giant tree in the middle of the field that just kind of stood out. And it was always this picture of, for me, how did that tree survive? And the answer was, it had a root system that probably was both grounding it and pulling in the nutrients that were required for its particular growth in that point in time. But it's too late for the tree to try to grow the roots in the midst of the storm. And I think if we're talking about what I think are probably the legitimate issues with a lot of people who go through the quote-unquote deconstruction, I'm not sure that they were given the proper nutrients and foundation and soil quality to be able to grow roots that actually gave them subsistence, so that when those things did happen, it was somewhat too late already. And so I think, what I would want to encourage people is that the point of deconstruction is reconstruction, because if you deconstruct something and you don't reconstruct it, it's just demolition, right? And so your worldview perspective shouldn't be a movement of demolition. Doubt is not a problem, but it's not the destination. So if we see doubt as the destination and we get fixated with that, we're not actually getting to the answers that we should be pursuing in a lot of those things. And unfortunately, I think that's what I see a lot, is that people are kind of taking doubt and they're putting it in the place of the final place where the answer should come from. And they're pushing into their questions, but without actually trying to seek answers. And in that sense, a lot of people become cynics rather than skeptics. Because I'm, to some degree, I'm a skeptic. I will reserve judgment on a particular topic until I feel like I have sufficient answers for any said topic. But a cynic, I think, is doing so because the questions are the end point for them. And I think that's where we should be honest and self-reflective and say, maybe there are actually answers that provide sufficient groundwork to actually reconstruct the deconstruction that we've been putting ourselves through.
And right now, while you're talking about reconstruction, I love this. It's just perfect because we've asked a bunch of millennials and even some Gen Zs for their top questions for you. And so ready for that?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, let's do that. Okay, well, the first big question is, how do we prove that God exists, or how do we prove that atheism is actually the answer?
Yeah, I think part of the question, if I was asked this question, prove to me that God exists, what I would want to do with that particular person is I would want to ask what they're looking for in regards to proof. Because even academically in my own field, the word proof is this nebulous, problematic term, because proof and evidence are not synonymous, and they're not always the same thing. And so in some regards, proof will be based on what any one individual is looking for. And what might be considered proof for you to draw a particular conclusion might not be proof for another person. Proof mathematically is very sound, right? 1 + 1 = 2, and that's going to be true with a capital T no matter what the situation is. But as a historian, truth is a probability issue. It's an inference to the best explanation. And so we're looking for things on a higher probability of whether they actually happened or a lower probability based on a number of intervening factors. And so if we're looking for an answer to prove God exists, I think the question kind of sets up the terms to maybe leave that person wanting to begin with. So what I want to do is actually find out what that person means by proof and try to provide something that would potentially speak into what they're looking for in particular. Maybe the question is existential. Maybe they're looking for a God who they can feel knows them intimately and loves them. And maybe the question that they're looking for is scientific, and they're looking for a design answer. You know, how do we look at the world around us and look into the details of the cell or, biology, chemistry, and find evidence of something beyond matter and motion that gives an answer? Or maybe it's philosophical. Maybe they're trying to answer philosophical questions that are being posed to them or that they are encountering about, a good God in a world that is complicated and all of these things. So there isn't necessarily one silver bullet in terms of a proof for God, because if you have 100 people in a room, you have 100 different avenues that they might be looking for that could very well give them what they're searching in terms of who they think God could be. And the answers to those questions are going to show them who God is, but it's different avenues to the same destination.
So good and so insightful. I'm picturing myself and my husband right now, because all I need is to feel God's presence, but he needs to know that the biblical texts are accurate and provable. So very interesting. Okay, here's the next question from our young millennials. I guess they're not as young anymore, and our young Gen Z, so our millennials and Gen Z. How could a good God allow evil and suffering in the world? And I hear their heart on that question, because they are inundated with terrible news constantly on places like social media.
Yeah, well, that is arguably the hardest and most pressing apologetic question there is. Because ultimately, the very tidy philosophical and theological answer isn't the right answer sometimes. Sometimes the right answer to the wrong question is the wrong answer. Because I've encountered situations where someone has brought up a variation of the problem of evil to me, and I've just felt uneasy about maybe the tenure that they're coming at with the question, kind of the character that maybe is behind the scenes, and asking them, that's a great question, why are you asking that question in particular? And finding out, once again, like the previous question related to it, they're personally hurting. And so in that sense, I could give a tidy answer about, if you're positing that something is good, you're positing that there's an objective good and evil, and if there's an objective good and evil, then you're positing an objective law, and an objective law needs an objective lawgiver. So where do we find the groundwork for an objective lawgiver to begin with? Otherwise, you may not like certain things, but to say they ought not to happen is actually an ethical leap to an objective reality that you may or may not have groundwork for. But if that person is struggling because a family member of theirs has cancer, then that particular maybe tidy, tied up in a nice bow answer is not going to speak to them whatsoever. And so that's why that's the hardest question, because there are actually very good answers to it, but often it doesn't speak to the person in front of you, because questions have questioners that sit behind them. And one of the pitfalls of my chosen field of ministry, apologetics, is that sometimes we give answers where we talk at people rather than with people, and there's a danger to that. Because the Christian faith isn't just an intellectual assent, right? It's a personal relationship. And that should also be played out in the answers that we give. So in one sense, I would say that I talk to a lot of people who go through that particular issue, and sometimes they assume that removing God from the equation is the answer because they're wrestling with this good God, bad world. How do I put these two things together? Unfortunately, though, I think if you remove God from the picture, you're removing an essential component of even raising the objection to begin with. Like I said before, where are we getting these ideas that this is evil and that this other thing is good and that you should be doing situation B above situation A? And ultimately, I think the Christian worldview is unique in that the God of the Bible is not it's not the God of deism who creates and just kind of lets the clockwork dials and switches go into place and looks from afar, viewing what's going on, but actually enters into the creation and experiences pain and suffering and uncertainty and ultimately murder. And so in that sense, the God of the Bible can truly identify with the person who is suffering, because the God of the Bible looks at us when we say, I don't get it. I'm hurting. God, what's going on? And he can say, I understand that. You don't like evil. Me neither. Look at what it did to my son. And there's an aspect of that which I don't think you can find in other worldview perspectives to the same degree.
When you look at the worldview of other world religions, how is Christianity different? And how do we answer the assumption that all roads lead to God equally, and that Jesus, his claims weren't exclusive, that he is the only way to God? How do we unpack the different world religions and understand that?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people assume that Christianity is exclusive and that other worldviews aren't. And unfortunately, that's not the case. Every worldview is going to be exclusive at some point, because all worldviews are making grand claims about whether that's the origin of the universe, or about how to be a good person, or how to seek something that's desirable after this particular time that we experience on earth. And even an atheistic worldview is going to say that a religious worldview is wrong. And so all worldviews are going to be exclusive. Even the inclusivistic ones, who attempt to grab bag all the parts that they like of any one particular religion, they're going to exclude the exclusivists. And so in that sense, they themselves are likewise exclusivistic. So I think we can stop pretending that there is such thing as neutrality, and that we can own the fact that everybody is going to push back on something, even if it's pushing back on the exclusivists. So that's, I think, a good place to start. But then the kind of place to go on from there is in looking at the Christian worldview. The Christian worldview is different in that a lot of the other worldviews, if not all of the other worldviews, have some form of moralistic ideal to be able to live up to a standard. That can be emotional, that can be intellectual, that can be pragmatic, but if it's telling you, be the best at doing this thing, or be the best at feeling this thing, or being the best at learning this thing, it's all put on your shoulders. And the Christian worldview, I sometimes say, my friend Glenn Scrivener out in the UK with Speak Life Ministries, he has this version that I've taken and adapted where he says, all worldviews are some form of survival of the fittest, but in Christianity, the difference is that the fittest steps down and sacrifices himself for the survival of the weakest. And that switching of motivations really does make Christianity unique, in that it's not about you doing the best or feeling the best or thinking the best, because those things are never going to live up to God's standards. Marred by sin, all of our thinking and feeling and doing is always going to be insufficient. However, because Jesus comes into the picture and he does and feels and thinks the best, he's the perfect example of a human being because he is God incarnate, then we can actually rely on what he has done rather than what we do. And there's a burden releasing in that is unique to Christianity, in that all the other worldviews, at least that I have studied, are telling me to do something. And maybe I do that really well for a short period of time, and that's great. And now I'm kind of on my high horse, but I'm potentially getting arrogant about it because now I'm looking down at people who don't. And if I'm not living up to that standard, that can cause a lot of anxiety and hopelessness in me. Well, Christianity breaks that dichotomy in saying, stop trying. Don't put the effort in that regard. It's not do and you're accepted. You're accepted. Now you can do. You can think and feel and learn all of the things that God has given you to love him with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Those aren't the basis by which you are accepted by God. God accepts you on the basis of his Son. He accepts you on the basis of that, the simplicity of putting your trust and hope in Jesus. And now you're not saved by your works, but you're saved for those works. And those works can be an outpouring and a showing of the identity that you've now found in Christ Jesus.
So beautifully explained, and Will, that brought tears to my eyes listening, because you think about the freedom a lot of people need to hear, that it's not work they do, it's something Jesus will do for them. From whatever world religion they come from, whatever worldview, whatever ideology. Wes, looking at all of the historical documents that you focused on, something that really matters is the resurrection of Jesus. And it's top of mind for so many people, so many young people. How do we know that Jesus was really that he really rose from the dead? How do we know that he was really resurrected? And if that is true, that he was resurrected from the dead, what does that mean for the world?
Yeah, well, one of the ways I explain this is maybe a little bit out of the box, in that I think one of the best arguments for Jesus' resurrection is the fact that you and I are talking about it today. 2025, 2,000 years after the actual event, why are we still talking about this? Because there were other messianic figures in the ancient world, prior to and after Jesus, who came and tried to be the figure that would allow Israel to be broken from the bonds of Roman occupation. And when those figureheads died and they were buried, the movement was died and buried with them. So what is it about the fact that we're still talking about this guy, Jesus of Nazareth, this first century itinerant rabbi who walked the dusty streets of Galilee and made the claims that he did and did the things that he did? What is it about him? Well, I think it's because, unlike the other figures, he didn't stay dead and buried in the grave. That his immediate followers went from a bunch of scared men in an upper room who didn't know what they were going to do next, to being the greatest ethical and spiritual missionary force the world has ever seen. That in a few hundred years, Christianity went from 11 scared disciples to one of the biggest movements that this world has ever experienced. And so there are historical validations for that actually taking place. But I think ultimately, the fact that we're still talking about it gives credence to the fact that something happened. What's the explanation for it? It deserves some sort of explanatory witness. And I think ultimately, once you actually do start to stack up, whether that's the historical or philosophical, whatever evidence that you have on the particular side of the equation, I think that only provides the bag of evidence for the actual conclusion of we're still talking about it because it happened. And there's good reason to believe that it happened. But we're not talking about Simon Bar Giora, who was a messianic figure in the same period of antiquity. Well, it's because he died. And his body is, somewhere disintegrated in Israel today. But Jesus' body isn't. It's, as those first century documents that we call the New Testament say, he's seated at the right hand of the Father, interceding on our behalf as the risen God-man. And that's a theological category of what's going on, but it doesn't negate that is what we truly believe Jesus is doing here and now, and we're talking about it.
And when we put our hope and our trust in who Jesus was and who he said he was, and the fact that he's seated now, resurrected, at the right hand of God, how does that shift our now and our future?
Yeah, well, I think ultimately it changes the way that I operate, right? Like, if anything has been a testimony in my life, especially being part of the academic world, where there's a lot of individuals who know quite a bit about, say, the biblical text or theological explanations for things, who aren't then changed by them, it's only proved to me more and more that the reality of the faith that I hold is not an intellectual matter. I can know all the right things and still yet not believe them. And in that sense, when Paul says in Romans that faith is a gift, that it's something that is imparted upon a believer, that makes sense to me, because the reality of the resurrection is ultimately, it transpires in, I know my life has been changed. I have seen myself go from spiritually dead to spiritually alive and desire the things that God wants. And so when I obey Jesus, and when he says, if you pray to me, I will give you the desires of your hearts. Well, I understand what that is, because when my life is in tune with Jesus's life, the desires of my hearts are what Jesus has called me to be and do. And so when I pray for a Lamborghini and I don't get a Lamborghini, that's because that's the desire of my heart, not of, God's heart, and I'm out of tune with that particular thing. I don't think I've ever prayed for a Lamborghini, by the way. But that kind of thing where I see the change, and that change actually speaks outside of the historical, scientific, philosophical, psychological evidences that, I think are very important. I think that we should be giving those reasons for the hope that we have. But once again, in that verse that I quoted earlier, it's revere Christ as Lord in your heart. And that's what's going to make the difference for me and give me the ability to then live out a life that exemplifies that hope, so that other people are asking, what is it about, the hope that you have? And in that sense, that hope is going to speak volumes, in that I want people to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I do. I genuinely do. Because I believe that those are actual historical documents that testify to things that actually happened by eyewitnesses, or testimonies of eyewitnesses who actually saw the things that Jesus said and did. However, my life as a Christian is also a testimony. It's also a gospel witness. And there are all sorts of people in my life who have not, are not, and maybe will not read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but they're reading me. And so in that sense, if my life can be that witness, that hope, then by reading the gospel that I am and my life exemplifies, that should be an encouragement for me to point them to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Wes, that's incredible. Listening to you, I think about the people watching right now who may be coming from other world religions. They may be coming from Islam or Judaism, Hinduism. You've got people who have deconstructed their faith potentially, young millennials. You've got people who are coming from atheist backgrounds, struggling with all kinds of ideas, but maybe in this moment there's something in their hearts where they have felt a curiosity piqued about Jesus. And I feel like our conversation boils down to that. What would you say to them right now?
I would say that it's very important that you get the right Jesus, because I have all sorts of friends within Islam who say, we love Jesus, or my Buddhist friends who see Jesus as some sort of sage or guru, and they say, we love Jesus. And unfortunately, the reality is that what they think or who they think Jesus is not a Jesus who can ever save them. And so if I want to encourage them to actually find what the truth is, in one sense, my commitment is to truth with a capital T, even above Jesus. And that might sound controversial, but it's not, because I believe that Jesus is the truth. But I would want to encourage other people to likewise push into that, in that the Jesus that might be communicated in other worldview perspectives is not the Jesus that actually lived and talked and existed in reality. And so it might be convenient to believe that's who Jesus is, but a convenient lie is still a lie. And at the end of the day, if, as Jesus says, if you do not believe that he is the I am, you will die in your sins. And the Jews in the Gospel of John, who he was saying that to, they know what he's talking about. He's saying that there's a reality of who his identity is that, if not understood properly, is going to leave them in a place where they are not going to have an eternal security. And so we can believe all sorts of things about a Jesus, but unless it's about the Jesus, the actual Jesus, the historical individual, then, we're chasing at windmills, and that's not going to do us any good. And so I would encourage people, the only place you're going to find the proper and true information about who the Jesus who actually lived in reality is from the Bible. And so, despite any other preconceived ideas one may have, opening up the Bible and digging into that is where you're going to find that information first and foremost.